Hello, welcome to the stream. We're continuing the Federalist Papers tonight with numbers 47 and 48. 47 and 48 form a continuous sequence of text. Madison actually has a single thought or a single argument that he carries over across 5 essays, starting with 47 and going to 51, where he's talking about the separation of powers. These two that we're doing tonight kind of go together, and then the ones after it are, I mean, they go with them, but they're not, anyway. But the most famous of these is number 51, which is over at the end. We'll be getting to that next week. The big issue that anti-federalists had with the Constitution as it was proposed with regard to separation of powers was that the proposed Constitution would have different branches of government getting involved in other branches of government. For example, the president, which is the executive branch, and also members of the judiciary could be impeached by Congress, which is the legislative branch. Treaties, both the president and the Senate are involved with treaty making. You know, they affect each other. And the anti-federalist argument was that they ought to be in completely separate silos and not ever interact with each other. So that's where we're starting, is with 47. That's where he starts talking about this issue. And the big argument that he's making in 47 and 48 is that actually if you had the powers separated completely into totally different, like if the three branches never could not ever affect each other and check each other, then it would actually be worse. That's the argument he makes here. So let's start with number 47. Having reviewed the general form of the proposed government and the general mass of power allotted to it, I proceed to examine the particular structure of this government and the distribution of this mass of power among its constituent parts. So this paragraph actually is an introduction to the entire second half of the Federalist Papers. The first half is talking about a lot of philosophical stuff and a lot of like principles and about, you know, is federalism a good idea and so on. The second half of the Federalist Papers goes into details about the particulars of how the proposed system is set up. How, you know, the three different branches and the different institutions within each branch and what the powers are for each one and so on. And that's where we're opening right now with 47. We're kind of entering into that. But and most of it's going to be talking about very specific things. House of Representatives for a bunch of essays, then the Senate for some essays, and then etc. But to start out, these first 5 essays in part 2, I guess you could say, talk about separation of powers in general. So it's talking about kind of like the three branches in general and how they interact before he zooms in on Article 1, which is the legislative branch, and then later on he'll go to Article 2 and so on. So Madison continues. One of the principal objections inculcated by the more respectable adversaries to the Constitution is its supposed violation of the political maxim that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments ought to be separate and distinct. In the structure of the federal government, no regard, it is said, seems to have been paid to this essential precaution in favor of liberty. The several departments of power are distributed and blended in such a manner as at once to destroy all symmetry and beauty of form, and to expose some of the essential parts of the edifice to the danger of being crushed by the disproportionate weight of other parts. No political truth is certainly of greater intrinsic value, or is stamped with the authority of more enlightened patrons of liberty, than that on which the objection is founded. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Were the federal Constitution therefore really chargeable with this accumulation of power, or with a mixture of powers, having a dangerous tendency to such an accumulation, no further arguments would be necessary to inspire an universal reprobation of the system. I persuade myself, however, that it will be made apparent to everyone that the charge cannot be supported, and that the maxim on which it relies has been totally misconceived and misapplied. In order to form correct ideas on this important subject, it will be proper to investigate the sense in which the preservation of liberty requires that the three great departments of power should be separate and distinct. So what he says in that paragraph is simply that the critics are right to consider this an important issue, and if they were right, that the proposed constitution makes it so that one branch of power could concentrate power unto itself, then that would be a problem. It would be such a big problem, it would be worth not ratifying this constitution and just completely throwing it away. It would not work. It would not be a means of protecting the people's liberty. The reason the idea of the separation of powers is such a big deal is that therefore you don't have an opportunity for a single person or a single group of people, and it's important to note that Madison and the other framers are also thinking about groups of people, and people in general, like when they talk about separation of powers, when they talked about separation of powers in the 18th century, it was like you don't want a single person or group of people to be able to run things among themselves and just create a dictatorship. And so if you take the powers of government and just divide it among different people so that it's impossible for any one of them or any single group of them to control all the levers of power, then you're protecting against tyranny that way. The oracle who is always consulted and cited on this subject is the celebrated Montesquieu. If he be not the author of this invaluable precept in the science of politics, he has the merit at least of displaying and recommending it most effectually to the attention of mankind. Let us endeavor in the first place to ascertain his meaning on this point. Montesquieu, he's come up earlier in the Federalist Papers, back toward the kind of at the beginning of the Federalist Papers, as I recall. Hamilton, and I can't remember if Jay talked about him, but Hamilton, I think, talked about him. So he was early 18th century in France, and he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, where he talks about a lot of political theory, political philosophy that was very influential on the founders. The British Constitution was to Montesquieu what Homer has been to the didactic writers on epic poetry. As the latter have considered the work of the immortal bard as the perfect model from which the principles and rules of the epic art were to be drawn, and by which all similar works were to be judged, so this great political critic appears to have viewed the Constitution of England as the standard, or to use his own expression as the mirror of political liberty, and to have delivered, in the form of elementary truths, the several characteristic principles of that particular system. That we may be sure, then, not to mistake his meaning in this case, let us recur to the source from which the maxim was drawn. So he's making this analogy. British Constitution was to Montesquieu what Homer has been to the didactic writers on epic poetry. In other words, Homer set the standard for epic poetry in Greek literature, and then commentators on Greek literature would harken back to Homer and use Homer as their standard for like what is ideal, like the ideal epic poetry. And Madison is saying here, it's the same way with Montesquieu. The British political system was, for Montesquieu, the gold standard of political systems. So Montesquieu is the commentator on political systems, and he's looking at the British system as the most, as the, I don't know if perfect form, but the most ideal. Most ideal is not a good construction, but like the best, like the best system in practice. Yeah, and the British system did provide for the liberty of the people. It's a little bit ironic, perhaps. Not really ironic, but it might strike some people as ironic that the American rebellion, the American Revolution, was waged against the freest, I don't know if it was the freest, but it was a very free system in Europe, a system with which did value individual liberty and incorporated that into its political system. But really, I guess you could think of it as the Americans, when they waged their Revolutionary War and threw off British rule, what they were really doing was doubling down on traditional English liberties. That's what they were doing. They inherited this tradition of English liberty, and then when they felt like the government wasn't respecting their traditional liberties under the old, under the traditional English system, that's what they rebelled. That's when they rebelled. And the British system has and had in the 18th century separate powers. It's like there was the monarchy, and then the Parliament in Britain has three branches, if I understand correctly. There's the monarchy, House of Lords, and the House of Commons, and those houses, those the Crown and the Lords and the Commons all kind of check each other. Montesquieu was living under Louis XV or someone like that, so I bet the British Constitution looked pretty good. Yeah, compared to the absolutism of the later Bourbons, absolutely. The American Revolution was less than a century after the Glorious Revolution. If I recall, there was a lot of colonial sympathizers among the more liberal wing of the British politics. Yep, that's right. The founders, what are they called? Founding Fathers, they very much had the Glorious Revolution in mind as like a major precedent for them, for what they were doing. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly see the American Revolution as being in the tradition of English constitutional history, where you go like Magna Carta and Glorious Revolution. I'm skipping some stuff, I know. But like there's like these steps along the way of, like, I guess there was that unfortunate Republican period in English history, but for the colonials, they were in that tradition. They weren't starting something brand new, although I guess a lot of the rhetoric at the time talked about this being a brand new thing. But they were standing at the end, or they were in this tradition that extended back from them. They were part of this English political tradition and very much cognizant of it. So Madison continues, on the slightest view of the British Constitution, we must perceive that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments are by no means totally separate and distinct from each other. And that's true, and they still aren't today. The U.S. system has much more of a separation of powers than the British system has. The executive magistrate forms an integral part of the legislative authority. And that's what I was referring to with the Crown being considered part of Parliament. And at this point, I don't know if he's referring to the Prime Minister as the executive magistrate. I think he's still referring to the monarch, but maybe I could be misinterpreting him. But certainly the Prime Minister is part of the legislative authority. He's the prime PM, or MP. He's the prime MP. He's the prime member of Parliament. He alone has the prerogative of making treaties with. Oh yeah, he is referring to the monarch. He alone has the prerogative of making treaties with foreign sovereigns, which, when made, have under certain limitations the force of legislative acts. All the members of the Judiciary Department are appointed by him, can be removed by him on the address of the two houses of Parliament, and form, when he pleases to consult them, one of his constitutional councils. One branch of the legislative department forms also a great constitutional council to the executive chief, as on another hand it is the sole depository of judicial power in cases of impeachment, and is invested with the supreme appellate jurisdiction in all other cases. I believe he's referring to the House of Lords, but I admit I could be mistaken on that, but that's my memory on that. Blue Harino, off the top of your head, do you know when the English monarchy really lost any political power? It was super gradual. One important moment in that was, there was when they cut off the king's head. So there was that. But then after that, the monarchy was restored. That general period of William and Mary and Queen Anne, that's late 1600s, early 1700s, that's when a lot of constitutional changes happened, as I understand it. This is, again, off the top of my head. So there's the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So to explain what the Glorious Revolution was, the dynasty up until that point was the Stuarts. Like you probably heard of Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. They were the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth I had no children. She's famously the Virgin Queen. So when she died in 1603, she had no immediate heirs. So it went to her cousin. I don't remember exactly what the relationship was between her and James VI, but it went to King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, and that began the Stuart dynasty of the 1600s. There was James and Charles, and then there was essentially a revolution. They cut off Charles's head. There was a period of Cromwell, and then there was a restoration of the monarchy, and there were two more kings, Charles II, James II. Yeah, they were all cousins, right? A lot of people in England were not happy with King James II, who reigned in I think he came to power in 1685. They were not happy with him, and so basically there was a revolution again. Parliament deposed him and invited Queen Anne, William III and Anne II, right? William III and Anne II, to come and become monarchs instead. And so that's called the Glorious Revolution. James II smelled Catholic, which did not go over well. Exactly. Yeah, there was a lot of it was a lot of it was a religious thing. They were content, as I recall, this is my understanding. They were content to put up with James II and wait until the crown. I guess his sister Anne, was next in line for the throne, I think. Gosh, I'm this might be, I might be wrong on the details, but they were content to wait. And then James II had a child. And it became clear that the child would be raised Catholic. They would have another Catholic monarch. By this point, the people in Parliament were staunchly Protestant, Church of England, and they would not have another Catholic monarch. So that, as I understand it, was the impetus for deposing him. And they brought in Anne and her husband, William of Orange, who was Dutch, because they were Protestant, and so they would therefore be acceptable as monarchs of England. Oh, William and Mary. Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. And then yeah, you're right. And then after Mary, it was Anne, because William and Mary didn't have kids, and so then it went to Anne, who was like was that a sister or a cousin of Mary? I don't remember. Yeah, and then that's when, but there continued to be evolution during the 18th century because, so then after Anne, and by the way, College of William and Mary in Virginia is named after William and Mary. But then Anne died with no heirs, and so then Parliament went to a cousin of hers, George of Hanover. I don't know if that was actually what his sobriquet was, but he was from Hanover in Germany, and they brought him in 1711 or 1713 or something? I don't remember exactly. And that began the Hanoverian dynasty of George I, George II, George III, and then George III was the monarch at the time of the American Revolution. And during the course of the 18th century, there was further curtailment of monarchical power, of crown's power. The Parliament had been the kingmaker, basically, in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. And so in the course of the 18th century, the position of prime minister began to emerge. It was informal for a while, and then it started becoming more formal at the end of the 18th century. And then by the 19th century, it was, that was the prime kind of leader, political leader of the country. I think it was probably, I would guess probably around the time of George the Fourth or whatever, like early 1800s. I think it's probably around the time when the monarchs really ceased to be significant. I think maybe George III was the last monarch who had actual political power in the system. But again, that's off the top of my head, and I could be mistaken. I think I always assumed that the king still had lots of power in the American Revolution. He had some, but it wasn't like, he was definitely not an absolute monarch. And I couldn't tell you like what exactly his constitutional powers were in relation. Well, I mean, he mentions some of them here. Madison does, making treaties with foreign sovereigns, etc. And then those remaining political powers were done away with during the course of the 1800s. Parliament continued to concentrate power onto itself during the early 1800s. By the time you get to Victoria, I don't think Victoria had much actual political power. And then after that, like, but yeah, that's off the top of my head. George III still had some, but Parliament was making a lot of the calls, was making a lot of the choices at the time, like the taxes and stuff that they were passing. That was Parliament doing that stuff. Soft power, yes. Victoria had a lot of soft power, as did her successors, like George V. I don't know what kind of role Edward. I think it was Edward VII. What little I know of him, I'm not sure if he really cared much about politics, but I believe George V also had some soft power and exercised it. But yeah, by the time we get to the 20th century, the prime minister and the ruling party are basically the only ones in charge. And it's a more lopsided kind of system the British have compared to the US, because in Britain, there's no way you can have, I forget what we call it in the US, where you can have the president from one party, but the other party have the majority of Congress. So there's a term for that. I can't remember what it was. Divided government. I don't know if that's the term, but that kind of thing can't happen in Britain. It's impossible because the majority party in Parliament chooses the prime minister. So it's always going to be the same party. And so you can have much wider swings of policy between when you go from the Tories to Labour and back and forth like that. Oh, reindeer, still up. Crippled duck in Italian. We do have a term similar to that in the US, lame duck. But that refers to the president after the election, when he's not going to serve again. Like Joe Biden, for example, is currently the president, and then he's not going to be reelected. So in November, the election will happen, and then between November 5th, I guess, is election day this year, and then January 20th, when the new president is inaugurated, during that period, Joe Biden will be called a lame duck. So I guess they use it differently in Italian. But yeah. So, where was I? I think I got up to here. From these facts, by which Montesquieu is guided, it may clearly be inferred that in saying there can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates, or if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers, he's quoting Montesquieu, he did not mean that these departments ought to have no partial agency in or no control over the acts of each other. His meaning, as his own words import, and still more conclusively illustrated by the example in his eye, can amount to no more than this, that where the whole power of one department is exercised by the same hands which possess the whole power of another department, the fundamental principles of a free constitution are subverted. This would not have been the case in the constitution examined by him if the king, who is the sole executive magistrate, had possessed also the complete legislative power or the supreme administration of justice, or if the entire legislative body had possessed the supreme judiciary or the supreme executive authority. This, however, is not among the vices of that constitution. The magistrate in whom the whole executive power resides cannot of himself make a law, though he can put a negative on every law, nor administer justice in person, though he has the appointment of those who do administer it. The judges can exercise no executive prerogative, though they are shoots from the executive stock, nor any legislative function, though they may be advised with by the legislative councils. The entire legislature can perform no judiciary act, though by the joint act of two of its branches the judges may be removed from their offices, and though one of its branches is possessed of the judicial power in the last resort. The entire legislature again can exercise no executive prerogative, though one of its branches constitutes the supreme executive magistracy, and another, on the impeachment of a third, can try and condemn all the subordinate offices in the executive department. A reindeer in Italian is just for foreign systems, since we elect just the parliament. Oh, okay. Often for France when the president doesn't have a majority inside the parliament. Yeah. Oberstandbuch? I'm just here to say that James Madison is the greatest man of his time and is never wrong. A true embodiment of enlightened thought and a total style. Yeah, he has some, he's very clearly in the course of the Federalist Papers showing what a sharp mind he has when it comes to political philosophy. Absolutely. All right, so continuing on with Madison, the reasons on which Montesquieu grounds his maxim are a further demonstration of his meaning. Quote, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body, says he, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws or execute them in a tyrannical manner. So the same person enacting the laws would be executing the laws. And again, Montesquieu says, were the power of judging joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with all the violence of an oppressor. End quote. So again, he's showed, you'd have a judge, if judge makes the laws and then also adjudicates the laws, or adjudicates the laws, or and then also enforces them. That's what Montesquieu's saying. If you mix those powers, you can end up with a tyrant. So Madison continues, some of these reasons are more fully explained in other passages, but briefly stated, as they are here, they sufficiently establish the meaning which we have put on this celebrated maxim of this celebrated author. If we look into the constitutions of the several states, so he was looking at Montesquieu and the British system. Now Madison is turning to the U.S. states, and he's looking at the constitutions of the states. Because following the Revolutionary War, most of the states wrote new constitutions. Maybe all of them did. I'm not sure. I think maybe a couple of them did not actually rewrite their constitutions. But most of them wrote brand new constitutions. And they were of quite a variety of forms. There was a lot of variation, and I mean they had some basic patterns in common. They all had separate branches and stuff, but the details of how those branches interacted and the details of like who was the executive power and like how did he how was he elected and what were the relationships between him and the legislature and so on, all those could vary quite a bit from one state to another. If we look into the constitutions of the several states, we shall find, notwithstanding the emphatical and in some instances the unqualified terms in which this axiom has been laid down, that there is not a single instance in which the several departments of power have been kept absolutely separate and distinct. So the overall point of what he's going to look at a lot of different state constitutions, but his overall point is none of them keep completely hermetically sealed branches that don't affect each other. All of them have some degree of the different branches interacting with each other. And providing checks on each other, affecting each other's ability to do their thing. New Hampshire, whose constitution was the last formed, seems to have been fully aware of the impossibility and inexpediency of avoiding any mixture whatever of these departments, and has qualified the doctrine by declaring that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers ought to be kept as separate from and independent of each other, as the nature of a free government will admit, or as is consistent with that chain of connection that binds the whole fabric of the Constitution in one indissoluble bond of unity and amity. Her Constitution accordingly mixes these departments in several respects. The Senate, which is a branch of the legislative department, is also a judicial tribunal for the trial of impeachments. The President, who is the head of the executive department, and so in New Hampshire and in several of the other states, the chief executive was called president rather than governor. Nowadays, all 50 states, their chief executive is called governor. But at the beginning of the Republic, some of the states, I think the majority of states use the term governor, but a substantial number of them also use the word, like instead of governor, called them president. So New Hampshire was one of them. The president of New Hampshire, who is the head of the executive department, is the presiding member also of the Senate, and besides an equal vote in all cases, has a casting vote in case of a tie. The executive head is himself eventually elective every year by the legislative department, and this council is every year chosen by and from the members of the same department. Several of the officers of state are also appointed by the legislature, and the members of the judiciary department are appointed by the executive department. The Constitution of Massachusetts has observed a sufficient, though less pointed caution in expressing this fundamental article of liberty. It declares that the legislative department shall never exercise the executive and judicial powers, nor either of them. The executive shall never exercise the legislative and judicial powers, or either of them. The judicial shall never exercise the legislative and executive powers, or either of them. This declaration corresponds precisely with the doctrine of Montesquieu, as it has been explained, and is not in a single point violated by the plan of the convention. It goes no farther than to prohibit any one of the entire departments from exercising the powers of another department. In the very Constitution to which it is prefixed, a partial mixture of powers has been admitted. The executive magistrate has a qualified negative on the legislative body. What he means is, when he says negative, he means veto. The governor has a veto on the legislature. And the Senate, which is a part of the legislature, is a court of impeachment for members both of the executive and judiciary departments. The members of the judiciary department, again, are appointable by the executive department and removable by the same authority on the address of the two legislative branches. Lastly, a number of the officers of government are annually appointed by the legislative department. As the appointment to offices, particularly executive offices, is in its nature an executive function, the compilers of the Constitution have, in this last point at least, violated the rule established by themselves. I pass over the constitutions of Rhode Island and Connecticut because they were formed prior to the Revolution and even before the principle under examination had become an object of political attention. So basically, he says Rhode Island and Connecticut had constitutions predating the Revolution and did not incorporate separation of powers. So now I'm kind of curious to look at their systems and how they worked. I'm only 7 pages in. Yeah. So, okay. Let me back up a little. Let me look at the comments. Reindeer, what were they planning in New Hampshire with that system? Well, I don't know. It was just the system they came up with. Are you referring to Madison, when he talks about these states, he has like two parts to the paragraph. The first paragraph, he says, the Constitution of this state firmly says there will be an absolute separation of powers. And then he goes on to show how that the Constitution actually qualifies that. It's not an absolute complete separation of the powers, but there are examples. There are cases where one branch affects another, like the power of the Senate to impeach and stuff like that. So I don't know if you're referring to the second part of the paragraph where it talks about the different particular powers that each branch has on another. It sounds so weird to me to concentrate on the rigid division between the executive and the legislative, but not on the judiciary. In New Hampshire. Let's see. The Senate is a judicial tribunal for the trial of impeachments, which is how we have it in our system now. President, head of the executive. The executive head is himself eventually elective every year by the legislature. So the executive appoints the judiciary. Legislature appoints the governor or the president. I'm not sure what you mean. Rigid division between the executive and the legislative, but not in the judiciary. Well, I mean, the legislature is like electing the president, so there is that too. All right, so I have no idea how to pronounce any of these usernames, but you're only 7 pages in. There are 2 volumes I finished volume 1. Oh, wait. Ford and Lester Ford. No. Paul Lester Ford. That sounds familiar. Isn't he famous, Paul Lester Ford? Anyway, this book, The Federalist Papers, published in New York in 1802, was published in 2 volumes. So we're just beginning volume 2, which is it's actually a fitting place to break the 2 volumes because, like I said earlier on, volume 1, or the first half of the Federalist Papers talks about philosophical stuff, and the second half gets into the nuts and bolts of the Constitution. So anyway, this is volume 2. That's why we're only 7 pages in. New Hampshire sounds almost parliamentary. Yeah. Right. Reindeer, that's the point. The executive appoints the judges. Yeah. Well, I don't know how else you do it. You either have the judges appointed or you have them elected. But back then, it wasn't as common to have... Well, I don't know, actually. I'd have to go back and look at all the constitutions. Lou Harino, is there any requirement for how the state governments are set up in modern America? They have to be a republic. It has to be a Republican system, but beyond that, I don't think so. Like, Nebraska has a single chamber in the legislature. You know how most states, 49 states, have a bicameral legislature with a Senate and House of Representatives, which some states, they have the different names for those 2 bodies, but that's essentially what they are. Nebraska abolished, Nebraska, they changed their constitution in the early 20th century. I think that's when it happened, to only have 1 house in the legislature. And that's totally fine. Constitutionally, they can totally do that. Any state could do that if they wanted to. I don't know if... I don't think there's a requirement for states to have this kind of separation of powers. Like, I would assume that if a state set up a more parliamentary system, that would be okay, constitutionally. Yeah, Paul Lester Ford, I think he edited some stuff. He edited, like, the writings of Washington or something. I can't remember. Writings of some of those early guys. Reindeer. So in the USA, state judges just won a public competition, either appointed or elected. In some states, the judges are elected. I mean, in some states, county judge is the actual title of the county executive. So, like, in the U.S., you have states. Like, the U.S. is divided into states, and then states are divided into counties. 48 of the states are divided into counties. 49, effectively. 49 states. Well, okay, slow down. Connecticut and Rhode Island don't have counties either. Never mind. But most of the states have counties. We'll just put it that way. Most of the states have counties, which are divisions of a state. And there's a lot of variation among the states about how much power the counties have. Like in Connecticut, they abolished the counties. They had so little power, they just got rid of them. But in some states like Maryland, the counties do most of the services for the people that in other states the state would be doing. But in some states like Texas, you elect county judges, and I believe a lot of county governments combine the executive and judiciary powers. I could be mistaken about that, but yeah. But there are states like, I think Missouri does. There are different states where you elect judges. And then there are other states where the judges are appointed by the executive branch of the state. Yeah. Lou Harino, I'm learning through these streams. There's a lot I don't understand about how my own government system is set up outside the federal system. Yeah, absolutely. The state systems are really interesting because you would assume, just being a casual observer, that the state governments are just mirror images of the federal government. And oftentimes, I mean, in a lot of respects they are, but they can have a lot of quirks that... I mean, some states deviate much more than others. Some states, they really basically just copied the federal system, but there you can get some really interesting quirks in different states. Ford's edition of the writings of Thomas Jefferson. That's it. It's still regarded as one of the monuments of American historical scholarship. It absolutely is. Yes, that's what I was thinking of. I think he's done more, actually. I think he'd done more than just Jefferson. Yeah, I read a lot of that for my election videos. I read that because that's in the public domain, so I could get access to it online. There is a newer edition of the complete papers of Thomas Jefferson, but it's from an academic press, and it's under copyright, and it's behind a paywall, so I couldn't consult it unless I wanted to pay thousands of dollars to get access to it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so he was not the original owner, for sure. Collection presented by his sons. Oh, wait, no. So Paul Lester Ford was his son. So Gordon Lester Ford. Wait, let's find out. So is it Paul Lester Ford? Yeah, so he was born in 1865, and then his father, he's not mentioned here. I assume he's not famous enough to have a Wikipedia page. But his father would have been born, like, I don't know, 1830s or something. So his father would not have been probably not the original owner. So, but ownership went from Gordon Lester Ford, and then presumably when he died, his library was donated by his sons to the New York Public Library, so sometime in the 19th century. So Gordon Lester Ford must have bought this as a used copy at some point. Substantially different from Europe. Well, it must vary. I mean, certainly, like, Italy has a unitary system that I believe is Napoleonic based, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, that's definitely different. There's only one state in the Union that uses the Napoleonic Code. All the other ones use common law. What do they do in Britain? Do they not? I guess they don't elect judges in Britain, do they? No. I mean, the councils in Britain are pretty recent development, right? So, yeah. Reindeer, yes, but generally speaking, judges are like doctors, are hired. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, that's true. Oh, actually, yeah, I take that back because my dissertation advisor was British, and he was scandalized by the fact that Americans elect their judges. He thought that was pretty egregious. So yeah, that they definitely don't do that in the UK. But yeah, actually, in a lot of states, even the Supreme Court is elected by the people through a direct election. It's definitely not something we do federally, but in a lot of states, they do that. Not all the states. Some of the states, they're appointed by the governor. And some of the states they're elected. Growing up in a state where judges were appointed and counties were vestigial, it was a bit of a shock when I found out that some places elected judges and counties were super powerful. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a regional discrepancy there. The parts of the country where you have the strongest county governments tend to be in the South. Or I think some of the western states too. Oh, Staris Decisis. I don't know what that is. Stare Decisis. What's that? Courts will adhere to precedent in making their decisions. Oh, yeah, common law. Yeah, right. Yes, in all the states. But if a state, going back to an earlier question, like if a state chose not to use common law and rather to use like the Napoleonic Code, that is kosher because Louisiana does that. Louisiana has a kind of hybrid system between Napoleonic Code and common law, is my understanding. Okay. How far did we get? Oh, we were talking about New Hampshire here. Oh, yeah, so here we are. All right, so continuing on. The Constitution of New York contains no declaration on this subject, but appears very... Do I have this? Sometimes I'm paranoid about not having the right thing on showing up on the stream. Anyway, the Constitution of New York contains no declaration on this subject, on the subject of separation of powers, but appears very clearly to have been framed with an eye to the danger of improperly blending the different departments. It gives, nevertheless, to the executive magistrate a partial control over the legislative department, and what is more, gives a like control to the judiciary department, and even blends the executive and judiciary departments in the exercise of this control. In its council of appointment, members of the legislative are associated with the executive authority in the appointment of officers, both executive and judiciary. And its court for the trial of impeachments and correction of errors consists of one branch of the legislature and the principal members of the judiciary department. The Constitution of New Jersey has blended the different powers of government more than any of the preceding. The governor, who is the executive magistrate, is appointed by the legislature, is chancellor and ordinary or surrogate, is a member of the Supreme Court of Appeals, and president with a casting vote of one of the legislative branches. The same legislative branch acts again as executive council of the governor, and with him constitutes the Court of Appeals. And if I remember, I believe it's referring to the upper house, which was called the Privy Council. They were still using the term Privy Council in New Jersey for a while. It was a very tiny body. I think it was only had like 6 or 8 members. But again, that's off the top of my head. I don't remember exactly. The members of the Judiciary Department are appointed by the Legislative Department and removable by one branch of it on the impeachment of the other. So that's an interesting variation, because most states, as I understand it, and also in the federal system as it works today, the governor appoints the judiciary. But in New Jersey at the time, Madison says the legislature appointed the judiciary. According to the Constitution of Pennsylvania, the president, who is head of the executive department, is annually elected by a vote in which the legislative department predominates. In conjunction with an executive council, he appoints the members of the judiciary department and forms a court of impeachments for trial of all officers, judiciary as well as executive. The judges of the Supreme Court and justices of the peace seem also to be removable by the legislature, and the executive power of pardoning, in certain cases, to be referred to the same department. The members of the executive council are made ex officio justices of peace throughout the state. Pennsylvania had a very strong legislature at the time. They wrote, I think they wrote a constitution right at the time of independence in 1776, and they were so gung-ho about democracy that they basically gave most of the power of the government to the legislature, and then it mismanaged things and kind of like was an example of how bad things can be when you create a purely democratic system and just like give all the power to the legislature, which I believe, I could be mistaken, I believe Pennsylvania and a few other states where this happened was provided the motivation that the framers had in Philadelphia of like having a stronger executive and curtailing the power of the legislative. They learned from experience in some of the states that it kind of got out of hand. And Pennsylvania itself actually made a new constitution right after this. So this was written in early 1788. Shortly after this, Pennsylvania scrapped its constitution and wrote a new one because it was being dysfunctional. In Delaware, the chief executive magistrate is annually elected by the legislative department. The speakers of the 2 legislative branches are vice presidents in the executive department. The executive chief, with 6 others, appointed 3 by each of the legislative branches, constitute the Supreme Court of Appeals. He is joined with the legislative department in the appointment of the other judges. Throughout the state, it appears that the members of the legislature may at the same time be justices of the peace. In this state, the members of one branch of it are ex officio justices of the peace, as are also the members of the executive council. The principal officers of the executive departments are appointed by the legislative, and one branch of the latter forms a court of impeachment. All officers may be removed on address of the legislature. Maryland has adopted the maxim in the most unqualified terms, declaring that the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government ought to be forever separate and distinct from each other. Her constitution, notwithstanding, makes the executive magistrate appointable by the legislative department, and the members of the judiciary by the executive department. The language of Virginia is still more pointed on this subject. Her constitution declares that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments shall be separate and distinct, so that neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the other, nor shall any person exercise the powers of more than one of them at the same time, except that the justices of county courts shall be eligible to either house of assembly. Yet we find not only this express exception with respect to the members of the inferior courts, but that the chief magistrate with his executive council are appointable by the legislature, that two members of the latter are triennially displaced at the pleasure of the legislature, and that all the principal officers, both executive and judiciary, are filled by the same department. The executive prerogative of pardoning also is in one case vested in the legislative department. The Constitution of North Carolina, which declares that the legislative, executive, and supreme judicial powers of government ought to be forever separate and distinct from each other, refers at the same time to the legislative department the appointment not only of the executive chief, but all the principal officers within both that and the judiciary department. In South Carolina, the Constitution makes the executive magistracy eligible by the legislative department. It gives to the latter also the appointment of the members of the judiciary department, including even justices of the peace and sheriffs, and the appointment of officers in the executive department down to captains in the army and navy of the state. Back then, states had navies. In the Constitution of Georgia, it is declared that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments shall be separate and distinct, so that neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the other. Yet we find that the executive department is to be filled by appointments of the legislature, and the executive prerogative of pardoning to be finally exercised by the same authority. Even justices of the peace are to be appointed by the legislature. In citing these cases, in which the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments have not been kept totally separate and distinct, I wish not to be regarded as an advocate for the particular organizations of the several state governments. I am fully aware that among the many excellent principles which they exemplify, they carry strong marks of the haste and still stronger of the inexperience under which they were framed. It is but too obvious that in some instances the fundamental principle under consideration has been violated by too great a mixture, and even an actual consolidation of the different powers, and that in no instance has a competent provision been made for maintaining in practice the separation delineated on paper. What I have wished to evince is that the charge brought against the proposed Constitution of violating a sacred maxim of free government is warranted neither by the real meaning annexed to that maxim by its author, meaning Montesquieu, nor by the sense in which it has hitherto been understood in America. This interesting subject will be resumed in the ensuing paper. It's probably worth mentioning that none of these constitutions is currently in effect. I'm pretty sure in all these 13 states that he listed here, they have since revised the Constitution multiple times. It has been common for states. I haven't looked at all 50 states, so there might be exceptions, but it has been common for states to have several constitutions in their history. They'd have one or two in the 19th century, and then one or two in the 20th century. A lot of states, their constitutions were written and ratified back in like the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Hamilton and Jay were New Yorkers. Madison was a Virginian. Correct. Hamilton and Jay were both New Yorkers. Yep. All right, so number 48. It was shown in the last paper that the political apothegm there examined does not require that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be wholly unconnected with each other. I shall undertake in the next place to show that unless these departments be so far connected and blended as to give to each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which the maxim requires as essential to a free government can never in practice be duly maintained. So in other words, at least if I'm reading him correctly, I find that sentence to be a little bit convoluted, but I think what he's saying is, like, the way to protect separation of powers is by ensuring that the branches have certain constitutional checks on each other. That if you completely seal the three branches off and not have them interact with each other, then you will cease to have a separation of powers over time. Apparently, Alabama's constitution is new as of 2022. I did not know that. I didn't realize they had changed their constitution. Interesting. It's really interesting to look at the different state governments, but also hard because there are 50 of them, so it's hard to keep up with all of them. But yeah, I'm kind of curious about that one. I'm going to look into that and see how it's organized. The same use of extraneous commas that messed up the Second Amendment. Yeah. Well, comma usage was very different in the 18th century. They had different rules, like the rules that you'd find today in Strunk and White. I think Strunk and White talks about commas. Or the Chicago Manual of Style, or one of those like modern English usage and style books. They did not use those rules in the 18th century for sure. I'm actually not always entirely. I don't always entirely understand why a certain comma is in a certain place when I'm reading this old stuff. Like, I think it was basically where they would pause, but sometimes I'm not. I can't even tell why they were pausing at that point. 18th century rule is commas are like spices. Yeah, sprinkle them a little. Absolutely. They did use commas quite a lot. Yeah. Okay. It is agreed on all sides that the powers properly belonging to one of the departments ought not to be directly and completely administered by either of the other departments. It is equally evident that in reference to each other, neither of them ought to possess, directly or indirectly, an overruling influence in the administration of their respective powers. It will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature, and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. After discriminating, therefore, in theory, the several classes of power, as they may in their nature be legislative, executive, or judiciary, the next and most difficult task is to provide some practical security for each against the invasion of the others. What the security ought to be is the great problem to be solved. Will it be sufficient to mark, with precision, the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. Of course, he's referring there to the state constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. The founders of our republics have so much merit for the wisdom which they have displayed, that no task can be less pleasing than that of pointing out the errors into which they have fallen. A respect for truth, however, obliges us to remark that they seem never for a moment to have turned their eyes from the danger to liberty, from the overgrown and all-grasping prerogative of an hereditary magistrate, supported and fortified by an hereditary branch of the legislative authority. They seem never to have recollected the danger from legislative usurpations, which, by assembling all power in the same hands, must lead to the same tyranny as is threatened by executive usurpations. So he's making a criticism, actually similar criticism to what I was saying a little bit earlier about the state constitutions from the Revolutionary period. They were so concerned about protecting against monarchical power to the extent that they really reduced the power of the executive. The governors of a lot of the states did not have much power at all, and also of removing, like he refers here to, hereditary branch of the legislative authority. In other words, House of Lords. They all got rid of none of them had anything like a House of Lords. But according to Madison here, they were neglecting to consider that a democratically elected legislature can also be tyrannical. That's basically what he was saying in that paragraph. Yeah. Epiconograts. Impetuous vortex would be a good name for a rock. Yeah, it actually would. Yeah. In a government where numerous and extensive prerogatives are placed in the hands of an hereditary monarch, the executive department is very justly regarded as the source of danger and watched with all the jealousy which a zeal for liberty ought to inspire. In a democracy, where a multitude of people exercise in person the legislative functions and are continually exposed by their incapacity for regular deliberation and concerted measures to the ambitious intrigues of their executive magistrates, tyranny may well be apprehended on some favorable emergency to start up in the same quarter. But in a representative republic, where the executive magistracy is carefully limited, both in the extent and the duration of its power, and where the legislative power is exercised by an assembly which is inspired by a supposed influence over the people, with an intrepid confidence in its own strength, which is sufficiently numerous to feel all the passions which actuate a multitude, yet not so numerous as to be incapable of pursuing the objects of its passions by means which reason prescribes, it is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precautions. So he's saying that, yes, if you have a hereditary monarch, then the part of the government you have to worry about as most likely to infringe on liberty is the executive branch, the monarchical, where the monarch is. And then he also says in a democracy, and he's talking here about what we would call a pure democracy, where a multitude of people exercise in person the legislative functions. In other words, they're not electing representatives, but the people as a whole make the laws among themselves, but they do it in a part-time and kind of like occasional or basis. They're not full-time engaged in legislating. Then, according to Madison, they're likely. Then you're also likely to have a threat of tyranny coming also from the executive branch, from a monarch or some other executive, because there'd be the tendency on the part of the people in a pure democracy to defer. I mean, he kind of what does he say over here? They're too numerous. Not so numerous, yeah, to be incapable of pursuing the objects of its passions by means which reason they'd be too numerous to affect anything, do anything effectively, and so then by default the executive would have the ability, the monarch, whoever, would have the ability to usurp power. But Madison says if you don't have a hereditary monarch and you don't have a pure democracy, what you have instead is a representative republic, then the threat of tyranny is not in the executive branch, it's in the legislative branch. That was the gist of what he was saying in that paragraph. The legislative department derives a superiority in our governments from other circumstances. Its constitutional powers, being at once more extensive and less susceptible of precise limits, it can with the greater facility mask under complicated and indirect measures the encroachments which it makes on the coordinate departments. It is not unfrequently a question of real nicety in legislative bodies, whether the operation of a particular measure will or will not extend beyond the legislative sphere. On the other side, the executive power being restrained within a narrower compass, and being more simple in its nature, and the judiciary being described by landmarks still less uncertain, projects of usurpation by either of these departments would immediately betray and defeat themselves. Nor is this all. As the legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people, and has in some constitutions full discretion, and in all a prevailing influence over the pecuniary rewards of those who fill the other departments, a dependence is thus created in the latter which gives still greater facility to encroachments of the former. I have appealed to our own experience for the truth of what I advance on this subject. Were it necessary to verify this experience by particular proofs, they might be multiplied without end. I might collect vouchers in abundance from the records and archives of every state in the Union. But as a more concise and at the same time equally satisfactory evidence, I will refer to the example of 2 states, attested by 2 unexceptionable authorities. The first example is that of Virginia, a state which, as we have seen, has expressly declared in its constitution that the three great departments ought not to be intermixed. The authority in support of it is Mr. Jefferson, who, besides his other advantages for remarking the operation of the government, was himself the chief magistrate of the state. Jefferson served as governor of Virginia for a couple of years during the Revolutionary War. In order to convey fully the ideas with which his experience had impressed him on this subject, it will be necessary to quote a passage of some length from his very interesting Notes on the State of Virginia, page 195. Quote, all the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judiciary, result to the legislative body. But concentrating these in the same hands is precisely the definition of despotic government. It will be no alleviation that these powers will be exercised by a plurality of hands and not by a single one. 173 despots would surely be as oppressive as one. Let those who doubt it turn their eyes on the Republic of Venice. As little will it avail us that they are chosen by ourselves. As little will it avail us that they are chosen by ourselves. I think that's how you put that sentence. I'm not really sure how to parse that, but I think that's how you say it. How it should be read. An elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one which should not only be founded on free principles, but in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of magistracy, as that no one could transcend their legal limits, without being effectually checked and restrained by the others. For this reason, that convention which passed the ordinance of government laid its foundation on this basis, that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be separate and distinct, that no person should exercise the powers of more than one of them at the same time. But no barrier was provided between these several powers. The judiciary and executive members were left dependent on the legislative for their subsistence in office. In other words, actually, I think that means the legislature could fire them at will. At first I read that as they were in charge of funding, of budget, but now I wonder if the Constitution actually made it so that they served the legislature's pleasure. Anyway, and some of them for their continuance in it. If, therefore, the legislature assumes executive and judiciary powers, no opposition is likely to be made, nor, if made, can be effectual, because in that case they may put their proceedings into the form of an act of assembly, which will render them obligatory on the other branches. They have, accordingly, in many instances, decided rights which should have been left to the judiciary controversy, and the direction of the executive during the whole time of their session is becoming habitual and familiar. So, in other words, so that's end quote. That's his long quotation from the Notes on the State of Virginia. So the point of this quotation is there was no checks and balances on the legislature of Virginia. Legislature of Virginia had complete and utter power and could not be checked by the other two branches. What's the difference with regard to what? Iconocrats, or the control of the purse strings could effectively fire them without. Yeah, that's right too. Yeah. Some of this, I usually think of Jefferson as a good writer, but there were a few little phrases in here that I wasn't exactly sure what he meant. But yeah, subsistence in office, and so for some of them, their continuance in it. Yeah, so I guess it's both. Oh, that's what you're referring to. Was the difference? Yeah, that's what you're referring to. Executive and legislative. I'm not sure what you mean. Difference between executive and legislative. Executive carries out the laws. Legislative makes the laws. Executives aren't supposed to be able to make laws in our system anyway. Oh no, well, I don't know if you have there might be a delay on the stream. I just saw your question. Is there a delay in the stream? So that'll give you a sense of how much of a delay there is. But yeah, I wasn't watching the chat, so I'm a little bit behind on the chat. The threat to a republic came from the executive branch. Yeah. Well, so he was saying earlier, if there's a monarchy or if you have a hereditary monarch, then according to Madison, the threat to democracy comes from the monarch, who's the executive branch. In the British system, the monarch was the executive branch. In the 18th century, the monarch could not actually make laws. Parliament made laws. Parliament was the legislative branch. Madison is convincing me that the last century of American politics didn't happen. Yeah, the legislature. Yeah, we have very much moved over to a strong executive. I mean, in the 19th century, the president was not usually very much involved in legislation at all. But in the 20th century, there's been very much an expectation that the president comes into office and he has a legislative agenda that he's going to try to accomplish. A lot of the presidents in the 19th century were content to sit back and let the Congress just, the Congress would take the lead on legislation. Okay, where was I? Oh, yeah, this long passage from the notes on the state of Virginia. All right, so he looked at Virginia as an example. Now Madison's going to turn to Pennsylvania. The other state, which I shall take for an example, is Pennsylvania. And the other authority, the Council of Censors, which assembled in the years 1783 and 1784. A censor is, in governmental terms, an official who has the power to, check the other branches of government to make sure they're not being corrupt or not, overstepping their bounds, stuff like that. A part of the duty of this body, as marked out by the Constitution, was to inquire whether the Constitution had been preserved inviolate in every part, and whether the legislative and executive branches of government had performed their duty as guardians of the people, or assumed to themselves or exercised others or greater powers than they are entitled to by the Constitution. In the execution of this trust, the Council were necessarily led to a comparison of both the legislative and executive proceedings with the constitutional powers of these departments, and from the fact enumerated, and to the truth of most of which, both sides in the Council have subscribed, it appears that the Constitution had been flagrantly violated by the legislature in a variety of important instances. A great number of laws had been passed violating without any apparent necessity a rule requiring that all bills of a public nature shall be previously printed for the consideration of the people, although this is one of the precautions chiefly relied on by the Constitution against improper acts of the legislature. So he's bringing up several examples of how the Constitution said that the legislature had to do X, Y, and Z. The Constitution had just ignored it. Because it's not enough, Madison's overall point is, it's not enough for the Constitution to say that a given branch will have certain rights, will have certain responsibilities and certain powers. You can't just put it in the Constitution and expect the branch to do it. He calls that a parchment barrier. You need to actually give some teeth. You need to give some power to the other two branches to check, as in checks and balances, to check the legislature, to keep it in line. So anyway, continuing on with all the things the legislature in Pennsylvania did. The constitutional trial by jury had been violated and powers assumed which had not been delegated by the Constitution. Executive powers had been usurped. The salaries of the judges, which the Constitution expressly requires to be fixed, had been occasionally varied, and cases belonging to the Judiciary Department frequently drawn within legislative cognizance and determination. Those who wish to see the several particulars falling under each of these heads may consult the journals of the Council which are in print. Some of them, it will be found, may be imputable to peculiar circumstances connected with the war, but the greater part of them may be considered as the spontaneous shoots of an ill-constituted government. It appears also that the executive department had not been innocent of frequent breaches of the Constitution. There are 3 observations, however, which ought to be made on this head. First, a great proportion of the instances were either immediately produced by the necessities of the war, or recommended by Congress or the commander-in-chief. Second, In most of the other instances, they conformed either to the declared or the known sentiments of the legislative department. Third, the executive department of Pennsylvania is distinguished from that of the other states by the number of members composing it. In this respect, it has much affinity to a legislative assembly. It has as much affinity to a legislative assembly as to an executive council. And being at once exempt from the restraint of an individual responsibility for the acts of the body, and deriving confidence from mutual example and joint influence, unauthorized measures would of course be more freely hazarded than where the executive department is administered by a single hand or by a few hands. The conclusion which I am warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. Publius. So, in other words, his point, to kind of rephrase what he's saying, you can't, like the anti-federalist criticism, like the anti-federalists, some of these anti-federalist critics were saying, you need to have separation of powers where each branch has complete and total independence of the others and can't influence each other and can't be influenced and can't be affected by each other constitutionally. He says that would actually result in an erasure of the separation of powers because one of the powers would in effect take on all power unto itself. So there would be no separation of powers because the legislative branch would essentially become the entire government. And so therefore, in order to maintain the separation of powers, you have to have each branch has to have a real ability to set limits and kind of regulate the other two branches. Did Pennsylvania have executive council? That was one of its like democratic reforms of the 1776 Constitution. Let me see if I can find it. Wikisource has all the state constitutions. Oh my gosh, how did that get so big? Okay. Let me see. There's constitutions are here. Constitution of the United States. Where is it? Okay, portal, Constitution of the United States, Pennsylvania. Okay, so 1776 Constitution. Wonder if we can figure it out really quick. I don't want to just sit here and read this on stream. Oh, it's not lining up for you. You can't see the whole text. Well, let me just scan this real quick. Oh, it's a little bit long. Let's look for executive. Yeah, the supreme executive power shall be vested in a president and council. And then for the present, the supreme executive council of the state shall consist of 12 persons. I don't know how to... Oh, there is a way of changing the view. You can change the layout over here. You do that. Layout 1, layout 2. Let me see which one of these. Oh, yeah, so you can see the whole text now, right? All right, so let me go back down to where that was. Okay. For the present, the Supreme Executive Council of this state shall consist of 12 persons chosen in the following manner. So it was 12. Okay, are his 3 points about just the Pennsylvania executive branch's unconstitutional acts or both executive and legislative overreach? Well, it's about the legislative. No, sorry. So these 3 points you mean. These 3 points are about the executive. What he's doing, so what happened was both the legislative and executive branches had ignored their constitutional powers and overstepped them. So he's acknowledged, but his overall argument is about the legislative branch. So he said the problem in Pennsylvania was the legislative branch went crazy, And then he acknowledges, oh, also, he acknowledges the executive branch also did, but then he qualifies it with these 3 points. Like, yes, it did, but that's not the same as talking about an individual governor, because it was, these were largely wartime things, et cetera, et cetera. Sounds especially from his second point that he's excusing the unconstitutional acts only of the executive. Most other instances, they conformed either to the declared or the known sentiments of the legislative department. I assume that's what you're referring to. I would say that he's blaming the legislative. How I read it is he's saying it's the legislature's fault that the executive engaged in constitutional overreach. That's my understanding. But yeah, so that's that, and then wait, which would imply that he thinks that a 12-person committee is more likely to exercise more power that is legal. Yes. Okay, well, his reasoning here, he gives his reasoning at the end of this paragraph. Being at once exempt from the restraint of an individual responsibility for the acts of the body, and deriving confidence from mutual example and joint influence. Peer pressure. Peer pressure involved, but also lack of individual responsibility. So each individual member of the council feels free to propose these actions, knowing that it's the council that's going to, it's in the name of the council, not in their own personal name. And then he said earlier on in this essay, what did he say? He said something else that's germane to this. Was it this paragraph when he was talking about representative republics? Sufficiently numerous to feel all the passions which actuate a multitude, yet not so numerous as to be incapable of pursuing the objects of... Maybe that's not it. Maybe that's not the part. I feel like there was another part earlier on in the essay where it's relevant to that, but I don't remember what it was. Would-be dictator would be too embarrassed. Exactly. Well, no, he acknowledges that, like, you can have a system where the executive has too much power and becomes tyrannical. He just doesn't think that's... He's saying that the pendulum has swung too far the other way. That, like, in 1776, everyone was concerned about too strong of an executive. And so then they went over toward, like, as democratic as possible. And then he's saying that that went too far the other way. And democracy in this case meaning, like, the legislature is supposed to be the voice of the people, right? The people elect the legislature. The legislature is the voice of the people. So the legislature should have all the power. That was the logic of the 1776 constitutions. And so Madison's saying it went too far in that direction, where you don't have a hereditary executive. You don't have those elements that had existed under the old system. So that's not where we need to worry about tyranny coming from right now, in the context of the current state constitutions as of 1788. I think that's what he's saying. He's not saying that in general you couldn't have that kind of thing happen. But a junta member can shrug and say there's some strong personalities in the room. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can. Exactly. Weren't there 12 members of the junta that overthrew the king of Egypt in 1956? Weren't they all pointing fingers at each other? Yeah. But his point here, the point he's getting at over here, where he's qualifying the fact that the executive of Pennsylvania did also overstep, he's saying, actually, in that case, there was not a single executive. So you can't blame it on that. And the fact that it was a junta made it worse. Yeah, Yeah, there is somewhere else in the essay. I know what you're saying. There was somewhere else in the essay where he addressed that. I can't remember now what he said. And Madison does, to his credit, admit that history provides a lot more cautionary tales about executive tyranny. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right, exactly. There are 12 angry men in the room with Henry Fonda. All it takes is the Pennsylvania Executive Council not having a Henry Fonda. And then, you know, right. So that's where we are right now in the Federalist Papers. We'll have the next time when we come back to this, we'll finish up the discussion of separation of powers, and we'll be coming to essay number 51, which is one of the most famous essays in the Federalist Papers. Talks about separation of powers, and he lays out, because these other 4 essays are kind of like he's responding to different, points, counter arguments and things like that. But in 51, he lays out kind of a political philosophical treatise on separation of powers as envisioned by the Constitution 1787. So that'll be an interesting one to look at. All right, so let me pause for just a moment to see if there are any other questions or comments, and then we can wrap up. Only went an hour and a half today. That was pretty good. F. Conagratz, I was reading about the modern Iranian government structure, and it seems to have a lot more checks and balances than I expected. Oh, yeah, it's a great deal. I've actually thought about doing a video about the Iranian Constitution, but I had a couple concerns. First of all, I was concerned that some people might think I approve of it. But I mean, that's not the kind of, I guess I shouldn't stop myself from doing it on that account. No matter what I do, no matter what you say in a video, some segment of the viewership is going to come up with some weird reason to be mad at you about it. That's inevitable. My other concern was they might actually overthrow the system. I don't know if there's going to be a constitutional change in Iran soon, so I'd make a video and then like 2 years from now it's going to be out of date. So I was kind of hesitant about that. A little summary. Oh yeah, so the flowchart of the Iranian government is, yeah, quite convoluted. I agree. And it is a lot of checks and balances. Essentially, the Iranian government, as I understand it, you have regular checks and balances, secular republic, representative republic type thing with checks and balances. But then on top of that, you have to have oversight to make sure that it stays within the bounds of Islam. You have to add some extra institutions. And so there are a lot more checks and balances going around in different directions. Yeah. So let's see if I can remember what Madison said. So we're starting. So to recap tonight's stream, so Madison started by talking about. So we're starting this new section of the Federalist Papers, talking about the structure of the government as laid out in the proposed Constitution coming out of Philadelphia. And he's starting here with discussing checks and balances in general as a concept, and responding to the criticism that there's too much interference among the different branches interfering with each other. So he's responding to that. In 47, he raised 2 examples to justify his position. First, basically he deferred to authorities in this first one. He deferred to a couple authorities. The first authority he deferred to was Montesquieu, talking about the English system, and showing that, well, actually, I guess that's the only authority he deferred to, Montesquieu. But he deferred to Montesquieu because Montesquieu is the guy that Montesquieu talked about separation of powers. When people in the 18th century talked about separation of powers, they were relying on Montesquieu. He was the guy who kind of was a big theorist about that concept. but he says, well, even Montesquieu is okay with branches interfering with each other and providing constitutional checks on each other. Montesquieu's okay with that. Montesquieu held up the British system as the ideal system, and look at all these ways that the different branches in the British system are intertwined. And then he pointed to the state constitutions as they existed in the 1780s, and he went through each one of them down the line from New Hampshire to Georgia, and he showed how every single one of them, well, with a couple of exceptions, a few exceptions, but most of them said that there should be an absolute separation of the three branches of government, and then also in the same constitution, which would have provisions for one branch providing checks on another branch. So he said, based on all of that, it's perfectly reasonable, based on the precedent of Montesquieu and the precedent of the existing state constitutions, that you can have a separation of powers and still also have them having some control and check on each other. And then in 48, that's completely escaped my mind. What did I talk about in 48? So he had Virginia and Pennsylvania at the end. What did he talk about here? Oh, yeah. So the basic idea of 48 is if you don't have some checks and balances among the branches, then the whole notion of separation of powers will cease to exist in the government, because one of the branches will inevitably kind of grow and become a monster and take over all the power. You can't, and he says, anticipating a possible response to that, he says you can't just write it into the Constitution what their powers are going to be and leave it at that, and say, well, you write it in the Constitution that the legislature is only going to have these powers. If you don't have the executive and or the judiciary being able to check the legislature's powers, then the legislature can ignore what the Constitution says, just at will, and there's nothing to stop them from doing that. And he calls that a parchment barrier. If all you do is write into the Constitution what the limits are on those powers, that's a parchment barrier. Those are 47 and 48. So, looking ahead, what we're going to be doing, we're going to talk about separation of powers in the next one. We're going to finish up this part of the Federalist Papers, separation of powers, and then after that, we'll get into Article 1 of the Constitution, which talks about the legislative branch. Yeah, Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd was simply a county judge. That's all he was. Yeah. It's interesting how, like in practice, you can write these checks and balances into the system, but in practice, people will, like, the system in operation, in practical terms, will kind of just, things will change. Like the amount of influence that the Supreme Court has in the federal system has waxed and waned. The amount of influence the executive branch has waxed and waned over time in U.S. history. Just Finn, might be mispronouncing your username. Thank you very much. Nice of you to stop by and watch. In old westerns, the judges were the embodiment of authority. Yep, they were. They were movies, but yeah. Right, they were kind of like, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I guess that's what that is as a county judge. Oh, Justin was taken. Yeah. Thanks, yeah. And they are, although I am way behind on posting them on YouTube, they are on YouTube in what's it called? Playlist on YouTube. Yeah, Clint Eastwood starred in a lot of documentaries, as did John Wayne. But yeah, county judge. Let me see if I can actually find some real information and not just talk off the top of my head. County judge in the United States. County court systems, often led by a county judge, carry a mix of administrative law functions and executive responsibilities for governing the county. And they give some examples. And Harry Truman was a county judge in Missouri. Interesting. In states like New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, the county courts conduct trials on misdemeanor and even some felony criminal matters. Actually, come to think of it, in one of the states, the legislature is called the General Court. What one is that? Is that New Hampshire? And I think that harkens back to, two states, New Hampshire and Massachusetts. I believe that harkens back to when they had executive functions. I don't believe they have executive functions now. Or, judiciary functions. Spelunky, is the reason why you think the Iranian constitution could be changed soon because of the bipartisan antipathy for Iran among U.S. politicians? No, not about the U.S. It's because of the protests that were going on. I guess it's been a while since I've heard about them, but the protests that were going on for a couple of years ago in Iran, seems to be a lot of popular dissent going on. Yeah, and Massachusetts has one. So, yeah, and I can't remember. Oh, yeah, and so regarding Iran, I don't know if those are going on still. I haven't been following the news, and I don't know what the current state of things is. I know the economy is still really, really bad in Iran because of the sanctions. Probably, I guess, partly at least because of the sanctions. I don't know, but yeah, like, I mean, but I'll think about it. I mean, it's the Constitution was adopted in like early 80s. That would be quite late for me. Most of the stuff on my channel is a lot earlier chronologically, but I don't know. I could mix it up. Let me see. This General Court is the state legislature. Oh, the name General Court is a holdover from the earliest days of the colony when the Colonial Assembly also had was a judicial court of appeals. Yeah, so I guess it's a holdover. They don't currently have judicial power. So I guess I'll end the stream now. And as far as I know, I'll be on for next Friday to continue with the Federalist Papers. At some point, I'm going to game again on Twitch. I don't know when it is. I haven't had a chance to. I'm working on a video right now for YouTube, and so I've been focusing on that. Yeah, lots more Madison. I don't know what game. I was playing, I think the last time I gamed on Twitch, it was Civ 6. No, yeah, was that the last game I did? But I was losing and I rage quit. So I'm not going to do that. GeoGuessr, maybe? I play GeoGuessr sometimes not on stream. Maybe I could do that again. I have not played Kingdom Come Deliverance. I've heard good things. In fact, I'm not sure. I might have bought it on Steam. I can't remember. Huh. I'm not sure if I have it. I'm not sure if I own it. I was thinking about doing Pentiment. Maybe. But you know what? It might be easier to do a game that I don't have to have a bunch of sessions for. I don't know if I can commit to a regular weekly game stream again anytime soon. So GeoGuessr might be the way to go, because GeoGuessr is, play it for however short or long you want. It's not like it wouldn't be a multi-stream kind of thing. Yeah, I might have to do Kingdom Come Deliverance at some point. I think that would be a good one for me to play. GTA 5. Well, there's the historic version of it, which is RDR2. Which I have not. I do own that. I did buy that on sale on Steam, but I haven't even opened it up. Prince of Persia. Which one? Which version of Prince of Persia? EU4. I don't know. I do play Victoria 3 sometimes. It's been a few weeks since I've opened it up, but that might be fun to play on stream. Although I understand that nobody likes Victoria 3. Apparently that's the least popular, besides the ancient Roman one. That's the least popular Paradox game. So yeah, I actually started playing Pentiment. I think I played for like 45 minutes. So I started a game. It's really cool. So far, what I've seen is really cool. If you're interested in city management in Econ, Manor Lords might be something you're interested in. Isn't that the indie game that was like really big back a few months ago? Everybody was talking about it. Yeah, I've been waiting. I don't think that's going to go on sale anytime soon. Which version of Prince of Persia is most historically accurate? I have no idea. I mean, I would love to play the really early Prince of Persia stuff, 8-bit stuff, but I don't own it. I bought the 2008 edition of Prince of Persia, and I found it unplayable because I'm a boomer and don't know how to operate the controls. I couldn't, like, you have to do this thing. It's like you're moving around, and you're skidding around on the walls and stuff in 3D, and I just couldn't figure it out. Elden Ring, and pivot your channel to Elden Ring lore. Yeah, maybe. Maybe I should. There's probably a big market for Elden Ring stuff, actually. But yeah, I haven't had much time for gaming lately. That's the problem. That's why a game like maybe like Age of Empires is another one that's easy to do, and like you could do it in a single stream and you could finish in a complete game, but I'm really bad at Age of Empires, so that's probably not a good one to. Like, if you're going to stream a game, you have to probably need to be good at the game, I guess. So, GeoGuessr is the only game I'm decent at that you can finish in a single sitting. But yeah, I think for the coming week, I'm probably not going to be able to play a game. But yeah, it's probably just going to be being very bad can also make for an interesting stream. Yeah, if you're bad enough, yeah. The trick is being so bad that you're good, and that's. Actually, the Prince of Persia one might be an interesting stream for about 15 minutes while I keep falling off the cliffs, but I don't know if it'd be entertaining long term. I guess I could do a quick stream. play Prince of Persia for 15 minutes, fail to get out of the tutorial, and then maybe switch to another game. Maybe I'll do that for my next time I stream a game. I'll try that. Yeah, I can't get out of the tutorial, as I recall. I can't even get that far. Anyway, so probably no games this week. But as far as I know, I'll be streaming Federalist Papers next week. Make the Vikings conquer the Holy Land. Wow. I have not played Crusader Kings very much, but I didn't realize you could actually take over a lot of areas far away. I thought that was more of an EU4 type of thing. Go around conquering a bunch of stuff. But I haven't actually played EU4 at all. I don't know. I picked the least popular Paradox game, thought it was really awesome. I love the economy. And then I found out EU4 doesn't have any of that stuff, and I'm like, well, why would I even play that? If you can't try to manipulate commodity prices, what are you even doing? No. Oh yeah, didn't even know about the stream until it happened on the playlist. Yeah, I have not promoted it at all on the YouTube channel because I'm bad at Twitch. Basically, that's why I'm bad at Twitch. So I was gonna wait and see if I ever got better at Twitch, but I don't think I ever am, actually. So I might just let this be a secret thing, you know. I don't know, maybe at some point. I don't know actually what I'm going to do long term with Twitch because I'll finish up with the Federalist papers probably around October or so, October, November. And then I don't know if I'll have another thing to do on a weekly basis after that. Yeah, cornering markets is fun in Victoria too. Uh, I haven't had the opportunity to corner it in real life, but Clove Market. But yeah, so yeah, it would be a shame for me to promote the Twitch stream on YouTube and then in November I just stop doing Twitch. So I think I better wait until at least then to see if I'm going to keep going after that on a regular basis. For a few of your favorite games you've played, I've played. I can't remember what I've played. Let me see. So this is. I don't think I need to stream my Steam library. I'll just read this. Let's see. I enjoy Age of Empires 2, but I'm bad at it. I liked Anno 1800. I played a little bit of Anno 1800, which apparently nobody plays. Only German people play it, but I think it's fun. But I haven't played it very much. Let's see, what have I played? I tried Cultist Simulator, and I didn't stick with it long enough to figure it out. I'm not opposed to playing it again. I just didn't have time to. I think I needed several more hours to fully grasp it. What else? Oh, I recently bought Hoi 4. Kind of want to try that. I heard the Hoi 4 community is super wholesome, so I was like, I don't know, but it was cheap on Steam, so I bought it. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. I streamed that back in like February, March. That's an old game, point and click game from the 90s. And it actually grew on me. I was really bad at it, but it kind of grew on me after a while. Do a stream about every executive order issued in the context of why they were passed. Yeah, you know, Mr. Beat streams stuff like that. And that might be something to think about getting into. It's impressive to watch you play GeoGuessr. Oh, thanks. Yeah, everywhere looks like Kazakhstan. Places all do kind of look alike. It's true. They all do kind of look alike. Railway Empire. I have not tried that. Yeah, I could see that. That sounds like an econ type game. Engine, like economic engine building type games. That would probably be up my alley. Blue Jay, welcome. Thanks for coming by. Yeah, that looks like on Earth, probably on land. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's that's what adds to the satisfaction of playing GeoGuessr, because when you do, all it takes is time. All you have to do is invest time in it, and you do get really good at it, and then it's really satisfying to see what essentially is just unremarkable street view coverage, and you can tell what country you're in, sometimes even more than that. Master of Orion was a game that I really liked back in the 90s. And I did buy it on Steam, but I haven't played it yet. Oh, I do have Kingdom Come Deliverance. Oh. All right. Well, it's ready to go if I ever start streaming it. Oh, I bought Myst. Wow, that's cool. I must have been one day where I was in the mood for retro stuff. That's it. And then Civ 6. I kind of enjoyed Civ 6. I think that's a pretty good game. Oh, Stronghold Crusader. I played a little bit of that. Never got really good at it. Master of Orion. The one I played was Master of Orion 1. I spent a lot of hours on that game. It's a good game. That was a long time ago. Ryan 1. My favorite game of all time. Let's see. What was the question? Few of your favorite games you've played. Okay, so that's like ever. I would take it. Well, favorite game I ever played ever in my life was StarCraft. StarCraft 1. I think they did come out with a second one later on. I was really into StarCraft for a while back 20 years ago, 20 some years ago. Played a ton of it. I played video games back in the 90s and basically the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. Then I completely stopped and didn't touch video games for 20 years. So there's a huge gap in my knowledge of gaming. Yeah. Yeah, StarCraft's amazing. I never played Brood War. Which race? I always played humans. I did play some Zerg, but I was usually humans. I never really got the hang of the Protoss. I think that's what they're called. It's been 20 some years since I played it, so I might be misremembering their names, but I think that's what they're called. The Zerg are pretty fun to play, but I wasn't. I was better at humans. There's fewer units to deal with. Oh, Terrans. They were called Terrans. Okay. Yeah, turtling. Yeah, that's a lot of fun to turtle. Trouble is, you're less likely to win if you do. That was my that was my experience. That if you're more aggressive, yeah, the Protoss are hard to play. That was definitely my experience. You really, I guess, if I remember correctly, if I can remember the game and how it played, probably just had to be really on top of your build order with Protoss and like nail the timings and everything. Vespian gas. I totally forgot about that. You guys must have played it more recently than I have. I don't know if it ever comes up on Steam. I'm going to take a look here. See if they sell it on Steam. They must. They sell everything on Steam. Oh, no, it's not on here. Oh, wait. Yeah, StarCraft. Did you mean StatCraft? Golly. That's too bad. Oh, it's on BattleNet? All right, I'll have to look into that. Oh, that's cool. Because as I recall, the Terrans were not actually the strongest race. So if you were hard to kill as Terran, that's pretty impressive. Gotta go to play. Yeah, all those messages. Your base is under attack. Yeah, it was such a great game. I don't know if it holds up. I mean, I assume it does. If I played it now, I assume I would enjoy it. I mean, it's like Age of Empires, but better, you know? It's sci-fi, I guess. I remember with Terran, you could pick up your base and just camp it in the bottom corners of the map. Oh, yeah, they were mobile, weren't they? Yeah, there's a lot about that game I don't remember. Yeah. Of course, it's different when you're younger. I mean, when you get older and you've got a family and a job and stuff, it's really hard to spend the same amount of time on a game. I don't know if I could justify to myself spending, having a 6-hour or 8-hour session playing StarCraft like I used to do. Moving your buildings was not efficient, but hilarious. Yeah, so, right, and the Zerg could not move buildings. And then the Protoss would teleport around, or is that just how they produced by teleportation? It would just like appear. But yeah, I don't remember if the Protoss could move their buildings around. I always thought the Zerg were kind of gross, and that kind of discouraged me from playing it too. Playing that race. Anyway. Yeah, I'll have to think about what game I would do again if I were to start a weekly stream again. Invisible units. I forgot they had invisible units. Yeah, I hated fighting against the Protoss too. Their units were so hard to kill. Um, let's see. Yeah, that's all the ones I have in my library that are interesting. I have a few random things that were really cheap. Oh, the tiny invisible surveillance. Oh, yeah, that's right. They had those surveillance drones that you could barely see. Yeah. Oh, I have Doom. Oh, yeah, I have several retro stuff. I think what happened when I was browsing for stuff on Steam, I saw all these newfangled games. I was like, I never heard of that. I have no idea if that's good. And then I would see this 30-year-old game, and I'm like, well, I know that's good. So I'd buy it, and it's only $2. Of course I'm going to buy it. So I have all these, like, really pixely games. Um, yeah, one of these days I should probably get back. Because that's what Twitch is for, after all. Twitch is for playing games. Like, if you're in Twitch, you're not playing games. What are you doing? Oh, but I also liked that idea somebody had up there talking about executive orders and stuff. That's a very, like, Mr. Beat type thing. That might be fun to do. Start doing a Mr. Beat type stream. I don't know if any of you guys watch Mr. Beat. He does a stream. He streams, and he'll just do that. He'll just be like, talk about all the different, I don't know what he does, Supreme Court cases or whatever. Social science. Oh, yeah, right. Which is for social science. BEAT. Yeah, yeah. I can't imagine anybody watches my channel and isn't familiar with Mr. Beat. It's spelled BEAST. That's how you spell it. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, he does a lot of modern politics. That's true, and that's not something I'm going to touch. He does get into that quite often, but Mr. Beat's not a history streamer or YouTuber. He's a social studies streamer. He does economics. He does politics. He covers Supreme Court cases, which is history, but it's also law. Oh yeah, econ professor with your game choices. Absolutely, yeah. I really like the econ stuff. There's a streamer, or there's a YouTube guy. Oh gosh, is it Unlearning Economics, or am I misremembering the name of the channel? He's an economics channel, and I guess he's a little bit like me. He's another guy who's a PhD, now does YouTube. But he streams. I don't know if he streams right now because I haven't checked in a while. I guess I can look and see, but maybe I won't bother. But he for a while he was streaming Victoria 3, an economic game. And then he was streaming some other stuff. But he'll do streams and he'll talk about economics. So he'll probably do it better than I could. Is he related to Mr. Bean? I guess so, kind of. Justin, thanks for the Prime membership, Prime subscribe, Prime membership. Thanks for the Prime sub. Yeah, Aficonograts, you've got to be trolling me. There's no way you haven't heard of Mr. Beat. Oh, and he also does music stuff too. He runs the gamut. Mr. Beat does. I spent a while on Twitch scouring it, try to find if there was anyone else doing history type or social science type content. And there really is very few. Very, very few. I'm not sure if I found every single one of them that was doing that, but and then most of them are doing politics. They're just doing political commentary, which is a different type of thing. So yeah, it's a pretty rare thing on Twitch to find that kind of thing. So I feel like I should probably game so I can actually fit in on Twitch. Yeah, right, the boxing match. That would be awesome. I wonder, Mr. Beast, I was about to say I wonder if Mr. Beast is even aware of Mr. Beat, but he is now because Mr. Beat made a video comparing Mr. Beat and Mr. Beast. He did a comparison video, and then Mr. Beast commented on it. So he does know about him now. So maybe a boxing match might actually be possible. Yeah, won't watch modern political commentary. Yeah, I don't either. It's I feel like it's kind of pointless. You can kind of predict what they're going to say. So I mean, there's such a formula to it. You know, whose team are we on, and therefore, how are we, what are going to be the talking points for this topic, and how are we going to spin this? And it's always about spin and everything, and it's kind of annoying. But yeah, so I guess I will give some thought to maybe doing a gaming stream. There seems like there might be some interest in it. I'm a little concerned though. These economic games that I have a predilection of playing, I don't know if they really work on Twitch. I feel like a narrative game is a better way to go for Twitch. Something like Pentiment might work better for Twitch. I'll have to give it some thought. I feel like I should play Pentiment through once and get a feel for how it works, and then I can go back and make different story choices in a stream, maybe. People who usually watch econ games usually just play meme strats. Who play econ games play meme strats. Yeah, exactly. I thought about doing that with Victoria 3. This is actually what I want to do with Victoria 3. I don't know if any of you have played it, but Republic of Texas is one of the countries that you can play. I've always wanted to try to make Texas really strong and like conquer a bunch of areas and make it a major power. That's exactly the kind of thing that would work on a stream if I could actually pull it off. The problem is I can't pull it off. So I could maybe sometime do a stream where I just play Texas over and over again in little 10 or 15 minute sessions where like I play for 10 minutes and then I get taken over by Mexico and then I start over the same stream, play, US annexes me, start over, play again, and like just do that over and over again for a couple hours, play like 6 or 7 in a row of those little tiny, like constantly losing as the Texians. Someone was playing Skyrim, ignoring the plot, and just trying to make a living as a merchant. That's hilarious. Hire a Gen Z video editor to put together a highlight video to post on a secondary channel. Yeah, I probably should. Although, I mean, highlights for Victoria 3. I don't know what even those would be. Highlight at the time that I made a bunch of money selling silk. Yeah, maybe I could. Maybe I could do that. I kind of like that Texas idea. I might think about doing that. All right. Well, I better get off the stream now. So we'll end this here. We'll be back next week, or I will. I don't know if you guys will. Next week to continue with Mr. Madison's arguments in favor of the Constitution. Thank you all for joining me for the stream. I have no idea how to do that raid thing, and even if I did, I wouldn't know who to raid, because no one else on Twitch is doing this sort of subject right now, so I'm not going to bother. Rule Texania. That's a good name for it. Maybe that's what I'll call the stream. Rule Texania. Should write that down so I don't forget it. That's actually a really good name for it. And it's ironic because it's going to be Texas getting annexed over and over again. Yeah, I'll have to do that. All right, thanks all of you, and I'll end the stream now. See you guys next week, maybe.